Right before the service started, we had a little bit of a scare with the projector, and it wasn't turning on, but God blessed us with that, and I was kind of just, I don't know if anyone else, but holding my breath during the service, saying, okay, hopefully it'll last. So we decided, though, if anyone would like to donate money towards a new projector, we will name it after you. So if you want your rights on a projector up there, just feel free, and we'll take that. But it's got a ring to it, you know. But anyways, before we get going and look at the psalm we're going to focus on today, I just want to say thank you to several people. Thank you to our worship team. I can always just appreciate just God's leadership in that, and again, Pastor Gunn taking the lead, and just great time of worship this morning. Thanks to Victor, and just again, I love more and more the last several years how our Hispanic congregation and Anglo congregation have become one in reality, and just such a big blessing, and so thankful to God for that. I want to say thank you to everyone who helped with our work party yesterday. We got a lot accomplished. I don't know if you saw out in the gravel area, but we have hundreds, if not thousands, of bricks and stones that were moved, and literally tons and tons of stones that were carried from the Charles old house to here, and so a big blessing in that. So thank you for who helped in that. Today we're going to be in Psalm 55. And again, the whole big picture of our series is just the reality that in life, we go through challenges. We go through difficulties. We go through things that discourage us, that weigh us down, that are hard to go through. And Psalms really provides for us a very real and genuine look at David specifically, but even some other writers, just their perspective on that. And it's real, it's raw, it's authentic. It's one of those things where they're willing to be honest about the difficulty of the circumstance. And we can learn from that. We can resonate with that as we go through trying times, it doesn't mean that we always have to have a smile on our face. Sometimes there's some very hard, weighty stuff, and we don't like it. And yet God is still God, and we can cry out to Him. We can lean on Him. We can be real with Him and find the hope and the joy and the peace that He provides, even in the hardest of circumstances. And so we're going to focus again on a trying circumstance and what God's Word has to say about that. So, Pastor.
Marcus. So a cry from the heart when the hurt is real, and just as Marcus said, life isn't always easy. And we don't have to pretend that life is always rosy and good. Sometimes as Christians, sometimes as Christ followers, we think we need to put on that facade that everything is fine, but if we're honest, we realize sometimes things aren't fine, and sometimes we're hurting. And it's okay to cry out to God when we're hurting, and to be honest with God. And we see that through the Psalms. We see this today. In Psalm 55, this is a Psalm of David, and you may be familiar, well, the title of the sermon gives it away. David was betrayed, and it was bitter. And he cried out to God. That's what we want to look at. So open your Bibles this morning to Psalm 55. Remember, our Bibles are made up 66 individual books. Old Testament from the beginning to Jesus. New Testament, Jesus to the end. And the Old Testament is a little bit larger than the New Testament. So if you open your Bibles pretty much right to the middle, you'll get to Psalms or Proverbs. Psalm 55. And we've been paying attention to the inscription here, just to the title and the information that it's given. And Psalm 55 starts this way: for the choir director, on stringed instruments, a maskil of David. I thought about this, well, it was Friday I thought about it. Wouldn't it be interesting if I just, used my guitar to preach this one? And would just preach it on the stringed instrument, and I couldn't do that, by Friday. But it would be interesting just to hear what did that sound like. This poem that David wrote, crying out to the Lord, it was meant to be sung. It was meant to be played and performed on a stringed instrument. If he was doing it according to Western music trends, probably in a minor key, probably slow and mournful, picking up speed, picking up some dynamics. It would be interesting to hear what that actually would sound like. We don't know what that sounded like. We don't have that record for us. But we are told, once again, that this is a maskil of David, a skilled song, a skilled piece of poetry, written with great skill and crafted to teach a lesson. Now this one, maybe more than the others, we can kind of pick out how this one was put together in a very skilled manner. I just kind of recognize, and you might disagree, we could break it down differently, but I would say this is a song in 3 stanzas. There are 3 parts to this song, and we'll look at it later as we go along, but verses 1 through 8, that's the first stanza, and it builds to a climax. And then the next stanza is verses 9 through 15, and that's David just talking about the bitterness of that betrayal and the hurt of his heart. And then that last stanza from 16 to 23, it's David really trying to center his hope where it needs to be. Dealing with the hurt and not denying the hurt, but centering his hope where it needs to be. And as we look at that, hopefully we can identify with some of that. I don't know if you've ever been betrayed. Anybody? Been hurt by somebody that you trusted? It's interesting, even as I read this, those old feelings and those old memories just kind of seem to bubble up. I realize, how do we deal with those? Well, hopefully we can learn from David in how he dealt with this. David, Psalm of David, Psalm 55. First stanza says this: "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Give heed to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I am surely distracted because of the voice of my enemies, because of the pressure of the wicked. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Behold, I would wander away, and I would lodge in the wilderness." Then that word Selah, remember what we said that meant? Not entirely clear. I like to read it this way, just that's a pause. We don't necessarily read that word, but it's a pause that tells us, stop and think about that for a minute. So we read that line, "Behold, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness." Think about that for a minute. And then he says, "I would hasten to my place of refuge from the storm, from the stormy wind and the tempest." Notice here, as David begins to lay this out, notice the emotion words that he uses. In a sense, they build. They really build on each other, and I think the emotion, we can almost get this sense of this emotion, this rawness of the emotion turning over again and roiling up until he's back to that place of just anger and bitterness and not knowing what to do about it. Notice those emotion words. The first one is, I'm restless. I am restless, and that word really means, it could be translated roaming. My heart, my spirit, my mind, it's roaming. It's unruly. That's another way that word could be translated. It's unruly. It just won't stay where it's supposed to stay. I know that I need to focus on the Lord. I know that I need to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I know that I need to be anxious for nothing. I know where my thoughts would be, but my thoughts are unruly. They won't stay where I know they should be. I'm restless in my thinking. I'm restless in my spirit. I just feel it bubbling up and roiling up in me. He says, I am surely distracted. Stirred up. Stirred up. My thoughts won't stay where they are, and I just get to be stirred up. That word could also be translated noisy. I just can't get rid of that noise. It just keeps coming back to me. A little later, he says, I am troubled, verse 3, because of the voice of my enemies, because of the pressure of the wicked, for they bring down trouble upon me. Trouble, distress. It's interesting, this word, with trouble, this distress, the root of that word, it really has this meaning. It suggests the cause, and the cause is evil. I'm troubled because of evil. I'm troubled because of wrong. I'm troubled because I've been wronged. I'm troubled because this wrong, this evil exists. There's just trouble, and it's settling upon me, and I'm feeling distressed about that. It says I'm in anguish. Verse 4, my heart is in anguish within me. Now, it's really getting descriptive here. Writhing. It really is a picture. It's a word of writhing pain. I'm just so hurt. I can't say, and it hurts, and I'm writhing in pain. In fact, some of you can identify this. This is a picture of childbirth. This is the same word that would describe that process of childbirth. It's just, there's pain involved. I can't just take that quietly. I'm in anguish to the point of being in horror, a shuddering. Just I can't imagine. I can't deal with it. And so you just kind of see how that emotion is building from being restless to being in horror. But then he says there's a longing for deliverance. Look at how he phrases this next. I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Now, here's one of these cases where I think maybe we can get a sense, we can just kind of imagine the skill with which this was put together and the skill with which this was performed on a stringed instrument. I think it's true. I'm not an expert on Hebrew poetry or Hebrew music styles, but I know in Western culture, Western music styles, especially in symphonic music and choral music, there's this technique, there's this thing called tension and repose. And in good pieces of music, go back and listen to any kind of symphony and just listen for that the music builds and there's a tension, there's a strongness to that, there's a building of that, it gets louder, it gets stronger, it gets more forceful, and then there's a repose. I imagine, this is my imagination, but I imagine that as this was performed, David would build to that tension, those emotion words building and the roiling emotions and the rawness of that, and then coming to this place of repose where David says, oh, if I just had wings. If I just had wings, I'd fly away into the wilderness. I'd be at rest. I'd fly away there. What do you picture when you read that? I'd fly away. I'd make my lodge in the wilderness. Now, some of you guys have some pretty definite pictures in mind, right? Nice mountain lake, rustic cabin, clear water, blue sky. You just smell the freshness of that. Doesn't that sound good? I don't think that's what David had in mind, because David lived in Israel. Probably had in mind the caves. David spent a lot of time hiding out in caves. Maybe he has those caves in mind. You know what? And that just kind of shows the turmoil going on in his heart at this moment when he says, I'm here in Jerusalem, but oh, if I could, I would just run away. I'd live in a cave again. I'd be at rest. I would be at rest there. By the way, that first response isn't always the best response. And I think we see that as we go through this psalm, that first response, that first reaction is not always the best reaction. And often it's true with us that when we face that trouble, when we face that pressure, our first reaction is, I'm just going to run away. I have to be done. I'm just going to run away. I'm going to find a place where this doesn't exist anymore. I'll find a new place to live. I'll find a new job. I'll find a new family. I'll find new friends. I'm just going to run away and be at rest. I'm going to find a place where there is peace. It's not always the best response, and David comes to that conclusion. You know, there are a couple pithy sayings here, just kind of trite little sayings that would highlight that to us. And the first comes to this idea, you know, if people are the problem and you're being betrayed and people are putting pressure on you, you could run away, but here's the truth. People are people. No matter, you're going to find other people, and it's amazing how you deal with one troubled person and somebody else rises up to take their place. You're going to find it. It doesn't matter where you go, unless you actually go and live in a cave and you're a hermit and there's no other people around. People are people. You're going to find those problems, but that doesn't work either, because here's the other saying. Wherever you go, there you are. Isn't that profound? Sometimes you have to realize that I'm part of the problem. Now, I'm not saying that that was the case with David. Well, as we dig into this, maybe part of that was David's fault. But we can't simply run away from our problems because we take ourselves with us. And wherever you go, there you are, and the problems are going to be there again. And so running away isn't the answer. I think we see David coming to that conclusion here. So what was it? What was it about David's life and circumstance that caused him to be in such turmoil? What was it that caused him to be in that state of anxiousness? Well, it was that hurtful betrayal. You may be familiar with the backstory of this, the setting of this psalm. Part of that hurtful betrayal is his throne, his reign is being threatened. And it's being threatened by his own son, Absalom. David is concerned with the city. And again, as we read this next stanza, he's just lamenting the condition of the city. Look again here, starting at verse 9. David says this, "Confuse, O Lord, and divide their tongues. I've seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around her upon her walls, and iniquity and mischief are in her midst. Destruction is in her midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from her streets." David is just lamenting that this city that he loves, this city that he tried to rule with fairness, it's suddenly in this state of turmoil. And isn't it amazing how we recognize that? Isn't it amazing how quickly lawlessness rises up and becomes prominent when that ruling force is removed, when that rule of law is compromised? When righteousness is compromised, it seems like unrighteousness floods in. That's really what David is seeing at this point. Unrighteousness and lawlessness is flooded in. And he says, I look around the city and it's everywhere. It's on her walls. There's mischief, there's destruction, there's turmoil, there's strife. There is no law here. The city is in a state of corruption. But that wasn't the thing that grieved his heart the most. And we read it in the next verse. "For it was not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng." And then these words, "Let death come deceitfully upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol, for evil is in their dwelling, in their midst." So here's the story, and you may know this. It's when his son Absalom took the throne, and he took the throne through craftiness and deceit. I don't know how far back to go with this. Absalom was one of the sons, one of the children of David. Absalom has this grudge against his dad, and it stemmed back from the fact that Absalom's half-brother raped his sister. And David didn't do a lot about that. Absalom later, in his crafty scheming, murdered his half-brother for what he did to the sister. And at that point, David banished Absalom. And Absalom had no contact with his father, and then eventually was brought back to the city, and yet there was no contact for a couple years. Then David's heart softened and brought Absalom back to that place of fellowship. But in the meantime, Absalom, desiring the throne of his father, set himself up at the city gate. Place of prominence, a place where you see people coming and going. He set himself up there with horses, with chariots. He was obviously a prominent figure. And when people would come into the city with a complaint, people would come in to see the king, Absalom was quick to intercept them and say, if only there was somebody who would hear your case. Oh, if there were only somebody in the government who was on your side. I don't know who that's going to be. If only, if only. And he won the hearts of the people. And through that craftiness, through that scheming, he went away with the ruse of offering a sacrifice. And when he did that, he rallied all of his forces and said, when you hear the trumpet, all of you who want me as king, go ahead and proclaim me as king. And he tried to take the throne of David. Well, in that political maneuvering in the heart of the city, all of the city officials, all of the government officials, all of those with status, had to at that moment decide which side are they going to align with. There's a man named Ahithophel, who was one of David's closest advisors. He's the one that David mentions here, his close friend, his trusted friend, the one that they went to worship together. Ahithophel decided at that moment that it would be better to align with Absalom than with David. Because he judged that power was going to be shifted to Absalom. He wanted to be in that place of power. So he became Absalom's trusted advisor, military advisor, political advisor, giving Absalom instruction and advice on how to completely overthrow David. That's the betrayal that takes place at that moment. We can read all of that, by the way, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, 16, on into 17, and how that all goes. David is heartbroken over that. Some of the words that he uses here in this psalm just describe for us, and maybe we can identify with that, just the character of a betrayer. Maybe you have seen that. Maybe you've experienced that. Hopefully you haven't been that. There's some characteristics of a betrayer that we just want to point out very quickly. And first is that the betrayer has a chief concern, and his chief concern is self-promotion. The chief concern of the one who would betray is just self-promotion. What's good for me? I need to do what is good for me. And so we see that as we go back and we look at that life and the playing out of that Absalom's chief concern wasn't for his friend David. It was, what gives me the best position? One of the things we talked about in our training of elders and this idea of shepherding is exactly the opposite of that attitude. You see, a betrayer will use people to advance his own position. But just the opposite is the one who would lead, the one who would shepherd, the one who would guide a church. Not one who would use people to advance his own position, but uses his position to advance people. That's what a shepherd does. But the betrayer has the opposite attitude of just using people and getting what they want. Here's the second characteristic that we see, and we recognize this, that he easily sets worship aside when it's no longer advantageous. Worship is set aside, and it's set aside easily when it's no longer advantageous. And we could say that with worship or with commitment, with conviction. Those things that were a strong guiding force, they can easily be set aside when they don't help anymore, when they're not advantageous anymore. Just like Ahithophel, who went with David in the throng, leading people in worship, all of that was easily set aside because it didn't advance his career anymore. And the betrayer will do that same thing with convictions, with commitments. It's easily set aside because it's no longer helping them advance what they want to do and what they want to be. Here's a third thing here, and we see this, and David even mentions it later in the psalm. And the third truth is that they are skilled at words, but promises mean nothing. Skilled at words, but promises mean nothing. Verse 21, as we skip ahead, this is David, and I think at this point David is speaking about betrayers in general. He's talking about Ahithophel specifically, but he's also just talking about our enemy Satan. It's true of all. He says, he has put forth his hand against those who are at peace with him. He has violated his covenant. His speech was smooth, smoother than butter, but his heart was war. Skilled at words, but his promises mean nothing. You ever experienced that? Now, I got to tell you, just as I read that and worked through that, just, those past memories boil up. And it's hard not to become angry. It's hard not to become bitter. And I recognize David's roiling, boiling anger at that, just remembering the bitterness of that betrayal. How do you deal with that? How did David deal with that? Well, we know that he cried out to the Lord. He didn't pretend that everything was fine. He cried out to the Lord. But in this next stanza, I see that David is trying to center his hope where it needs to be. And this idea of rest, just the opposite of everything else that was going on. This is David trying to rest, not by running away and finding a new circumstance, but trying to rest in the Lord, trying to be at this place where his thoughts and his emotions aren't unruly. He's trying to center his hope in the Lord. Look at how he says this, verse 16. As for me, I shall call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. He will redeem my soul in peace from the battle which is against me. For they are many who strive against me. God will hear and answer them. Even the one who sits enthroned from of old, with whom there is no change, and who do not fear God. We're going to talk about this verse in a minute. He has put forth his hand, now talking about the betrayer, has put forth his hand against those who are at peace with him. He has violated his covenant. His speech was smoother than butter, but his heart was war. His words were softer than oil. Yes, they were a drawn sword. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. But you, O God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half of their days, but I will trust in you. So we go back to that as David just begins to pour this out and begins to try to center his hope in the Lord. And as he begins to center his hope, he makes this statement that this is a place of real peace and rest. This is the answer. Running away isn't always the best response. Here's the place of real peace and rest. And David says this, as for me, I will call upon God. Now, I want you to understand that transition, because we could get that messed up when we look at verse 15. Let death come deceitfully upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol, for evil is in their dwelling in their midst. As for me, I'll call upon the Lord. Now, this isn't David necessarily saying they deserve death, I deserve blessing, which may be true or not, but that's really not what he's saying. This is David, again, just trying to get centered. I think there was a stanza break here. There was a pause here. Now David's trying to center himself again. And he makes this statement, as for me, I will call upon the Lord. Now what is he saying there? I think, David, if we could just expand this, we can almost hear him insert these words. And again, you can disagree with this. This is my imagination. But I hear in that just this echo of this words. He says, as for me, then insert this phrase, I'm not going to flee. As for me, I'm not going to flee because my source is right here. As for me, this is what I need to do. Not run away, not go hide myself in the mountains, in the caves. Here's what I need to do. As for me, I'll call upon the Lord. I will call upon God, and the Lord will save me. This is where I need to be. This is where my source is. This is where hope is. This is the real source of peace. This is the real source of rest. It's not in what I can provide for myself. It's calling upon the Lord and focusing my life at that point again. As he longs to see that, and he longs to be at that place of deliverance. Now, understand what he says here next, that God knows and God hears. This is not a case of David being a whiner. David didn't whine and complain, although we could read it that way. Evening and morning and noon I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. He's going to hear me. It's not what he's saying. David says, I'm going to bring this back to the Lord time after time. In the morning, at noon, in the evening. Every time these emotions boil up, I'm going to bring them back to the Lord. And I'm not going to pretend that everything is fine. I'm going to lay this out before the Lord with all honesty and openness to say, God, here is how my heart is hurting, and here's what I would do about it. You know that I'm hurting, and he's going to hear it every time. Because God does know, and he does hear, and he does care. You know, really, you might want to write just a cross-reference here in your Bible, because I think David is saying the same thing that Paul said in his letter to the Philippians. Paul said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, with prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And how often? Morning and noon and night. Don't carry that anxiousness. Let that be made known to God. And so here's David saying, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to run away. I'm going to call upon the Lord, and I'm going to do that in the morning, and I'm going to do that at night, and I'm going to do that at noon. I'm going to lay my request before him. I'm going to lay my hurting heart before him. You know why? Because God is big enough. God is big enough and wise enough, good enough, powerful enough to deal with me and my circumstance. And he's big enough to redeem. This is a great portion here. I think this is one of the portions where David says more than he knows he's saying. We sometimes see that in Scripture. Often we see it in David's writings in the Psalms where he makes a statement and it's more true than he knows. I think when David says it, he says, God is big enough to restore that which ought to be. He can redeem that. He can bring this back. He can bring me back to a place of power. He can restore power to where it needs to be. God is big enough to do that, and so I'm going to trust God. I'm not going to trust my scheming. I'm not going to play their game and scheme and manipulate and do this maneuvering. I'm going to trust God, and He's big enough to restore what ought to be. But at the same time, when we hear that word redeem, hopefully that puts you in mind of what God did for us. And that great definition of redeem is to purchase back, to pay a ransom. That God is able to pay the ransom to secure our peace. And of course, that just puts us in mind of everything that Christ did for us at the cross. That our sins separated us from God, and our rebellion severed that relationship, and we were under a condemnation of death, and there's nothing that we could do to scheme, to manipulate, to get back to a right relationship with God. But God was big enough to pay the ransom for us, and that ransom, of course, was death on the cross. And the price was paid in full, and because the price was paid in full, we can come back to full restoration, and we can come back to that place of peace, and that's the key for us. It's the gospel. It's the gospel. That God loved me enough to do that. And God is big enough to do what is good and right in my life. And so when these feelings and emotions bubble up, I'm going to come back to the gospel and remember what God did for me and who I am in His eyes, and trust that He still has me in His hands. I'm going to come back to that. Something else that we want to look at quickly here. God is still God. God is still God. Now, these verses, I just have to tell you, these verses, I just had a great time wrestling through this next phrase. Because I think there are a couple ways that we could read these phrases. As for me, I shall call upon the Lord, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and noon I will complain and murmur, and He will hear my voice. He will redeem my soul from the battle which is against me. For they are many who strive against me. God will hear and answer them, even the one who sits enthroned from of old, with whom there is no change, with whom and who do not fear God. Now, first of all, we have to understand who's being talked about here, because David's jumping back and forth. So when he says God will answer them, God's going to answer them. He's referring to those who are striving against David, right? So you might just jot that down. The them refers back to those who are striving against David. And it also jumps ahead, with whom there is no change, who do not fear God. Them, the ones who are striving, they don't change. This is their operation always. They don't fear God. Here's the part that I wrestled with. In fact, I looked at this and realized that I have a different interpretation than most commentaries. Well, every commentary. Nobody agrees with me on this. And in fact, I went into Pastor Onhill's office and said, Pastor, what do you think? And we wrestled this, and he called me a heretic and kicked me out of his office. Who is the one who is enthroned? Who is that referring to? Now, I'll tell you right up front, every commentary and Pastor Onhill says this is referring to God. But we could read it differently. So, the one who is enthroned on high. Go to that next slide. Even the one who is enthroned, maybe he's still talking about the them. And we read it this way. Even the one who sits enthroned, he's talking about them. Even the one who has enthroned himself from on old. Now, who's the one who enthroned himself? Satan. He's the one who claimed deity or supremacy over this world. He's the one who is called the prince of the power of the air. He's the one who has claimed himself to be the king. And when we read the following, it makes sense that way, that God will deal with them, and He's even going to deal with the one who has enthroned himself from of old, with whom there's no change. His operation doesn't change. He doesn't fear God. And the rest of the verses follow that way. Now, I'll tell you, nobody agrees with me. So I'll go back and realize that there must be a better way to do it. And by the way, Pastor Onhill had a great in-depth explanation as to why it refers to God. So we'll go back and we'll say, even the one who is enthroned, well, that's God. That is God. But here's why I point that out. Because I think even though my reading of that was incorrect grammatically, it still points to a solid biblical truth. And both of these truths apply here. And the first truth is that this battle is just really a skirmish in a larger spiritual battle. As David is hurting and smarting over the fact that his son and his closest friend have conspired against him, and it's bitterness. We're not making any light of that, but it's bitter, but he realizes, this is just part of a bigger battle. There's a bigger battle waging here, and this is what the enemy has been doing from of old. And that's why David, when he talks about the betrayer, he's talking about Ahithophel, he's talking about betrayers in general, he's talking about the enemy Satan. The words are smooth, but there's nothing sound in them. The promises mean nothing to them. But we could take it the other way, and when we realize that it's still God who is on the throne, well, we realize God is still the one who is ultimately on the throne. He is still enthroned. He's still the one who is in charge. And when we read it that way, then we can imagine David just getting to this settled place to say, Ahithophel is against me, my son is trying to kill me, I'm on the run, but I remember who is ultimately in control. Absalom may claim the throne, but I know who the king really is, and he's not talking about himself. Absalom may claim it, but I know who is really in authority. So you know what? When we look at that, we realize here that who God is and his nature and his character are completely contrary, a complete contrast of the betrayer. We would say that the betrayer has a chief concern in that self-promotion, but when we think about who God is, we see its opposite. We'd say that the betrayer's words are smooth, but there's nothing sound in his promise. We look at that the other side and we realize that who God is, and we realize that his words are true and his promises are sound. There's no deception in God. There's no deception in his promise. There's nothing about his promise that he's going to take away if it doesn't bring advantage to him. We also see that it's true here with God, that he's faithful to himself and he's faithful to us. He's faithful to himself and to us. The betrayer will use people when it's to his advantage. God doesn't use us to advance his own status. Now think about that for a minute. God never uses us because he doesn't need to. He never uses us to advance his status. Now he lets us be about his business, but that's not advancing his status. God is no more or no less God when we do what he wants or when we disobey him. He doesn't need us to make him more God. He doesn't need us to make him more powerful. He doesn't need us to make him more sovereign. God is God and will always be God. And so he doesn't need to use us to advance his status. And the last thing that we see, that was the last thing we see. He's faithful to his promise, and he doesn't need us to use, and that's why we can rest. Now, I want to come back to this in a couple weeks, because there's a portion here that we just don't have time to get to, and that's that command, that reassurance, that reminder to cast our burdens upon him. And that's going to be key in all of these. Whether we've been betrayed, or we're fearful, we just don't know where to go, or we're sick of the sin around us. How do we deal with that? Well, here's one of the keys. We're going to cast our cares upon him. I know we're out of time, but I'd like to have our praise team come back to the platform for a moment.